Hi, I'm Keri Blakinger, and I'm pleased to welcome you to the 2021 Brooklyn Book Festival for a conversation with Jaime Lowe and Reuben Jonathan Miller. For this panel, we're talking about the afterlives of incarceration, and everyone here has some connection to jails and prisons and the world that exists behind bars. Jaime is the author of Breathing Fire, a book about the prisoners who fight wildfires in California and usually can't work as firefighters when they get out. And Reuben is a sociologist and former jail chaplain who wrote Halfway Home, a study of the burdens put on life after incarceration. Our third panelist had a family emergency tonight, so we have a slightly smaller conversation than planned. And before we start, I also want to note that the books by all of the authors of this program can be purchased on the link below. And now I want to start with Reuben. The title of our panel comes from your book. You're the one who talks directly about the afterlife of incarceration. And I loved your description of prison as something that follows you around like a ghost. And I was wondering if you could tell us more about that and sort of how you started thinking of incarceration in those terms.
Yeah, thanks so much. I'm really grateful to be here. I'm grateful to be in conversation with Jaime and with you, and thank you for raising the question about the afterlife of mass incarceration. So I was following a scholar, Saidiya Hartman, who writes about the afterlife of slavery, and for her, the afterlife of slavery is poverty, incarceration, and premature death. And she's often thinking about the ways that slavery shows up in the lives of Black people, even when they don't expect it, in moments of pleasure, certainly in moments of trouble. And so for me, I wanted to know, okay, so what then is the afterlife of mass incarceration? How does incarceration, the mass incarceration specifically, this thing that we decided to do beginning in 1972, where we arrested more people at a higher rate every year for 27 straight years. That seems to me to be something that stands on its own legs, meaning it seems like, the kind of thing that would have its own effects, that it would show up in interesting ways, that it would have lingering effects, especially when I think about the experience of incarceration, how traumatic it is, what it means, the separation of people from the people they love most, from their families, from their friends, what it means to lose your freedom. And what I did was I started following people, and I noticed that incarceration, that their record, that their history of incarceration would show up in ways that they didn't expect. It would follow them like a ghost into the unemployment line. It would whisper in the ear of landlords, employers, licensing officials, through things like good character clauses that prevent people from getting things like real estate licenses or causes real trouble when they sit for the bar. And so that for me was its afterlife. It's the way it lingers and continues to shape the social lives of people long after they've served time.
Yeah, I mean, as someone who's done time, I think that's part of why that spoke to me so much. I also want to talk a little bit more about the sort of words that we use to describe incarceration. There's a lot of conversation in sort of criminal justice circles about how much word choice matters. It's like whether to use words like prisoner or inmate or incarcerated person. And Jaime, you actually, I think, have one of those words in your subtitle. So I feel like you might have been someone who's been thinking about this. How did you make these sorts of language decisions, and how much do you think language matters in this context?
I think that language always matters, and I think that language is an evolution. And so the words that we use are constantly shifting and changing. And I think that as a reporter, it was really difficult, and I weighed the difference between being called an inmate, being called an incarcerated person, seriously. And ultimately, I came up with the idea. I mean, I didn't come up with the idea, but I wanted to essentially put the people that I was interviewing, I wanted to put their voices in the forefront of everything that was being told in the book I was writing. And so if the women that I interviewed referred to themselves as inmates, or the other people that they were describing as inmates, then I used that language. And I used the words incarcerated firefighter other times. A lot of times, it depended on the person I was interviewing. And since the book has come out, I've talked with several formerly incarcerated female firefighters who really hate the word inmate and don't ever want to be called inmate. And so I think there is an evolution. I think we're in the middle of it, and I think that it's not necessarily clear exactly what the correct term is. I don't know that I have the answer for it. I think that the answer I came up with was that I wanted to respect the people that I was interviewing and the way that they talked and their words. And so I used their words in every situation that I could.
As someone who, did time, I appreciate that. Like, that makes a lot of sense. One thing I didn't realize when I was in prison, and I didn't realize until after I got out and was writing about these things, is how differently some of these words work in different settings. Like, in some of the male prisons, inmate was considered an insult, but, in the women's prisons, it was not. It's sort of interesting trying to grapple with that as a writer, when you can say something about one population that is what they prefer to be called, and then, for someone else, it's actually an insult.
Yeah, and especially, I'm coming from very outside of the system, very outside of having served time, and I wouldn't pretend to know exactly what it would feel like to be called one thing or the other. And I do think that this also relates to what Reuben was talking about in terms of, and I really like the phrase you used, that like the whispers in the ear, this idea that the idea that you did time and it travels with you and it continues to. And so I think that there is this sense that having been an inmate is somehow worse than having been incarcerated. Although sometimes I think that we're, parsing the language too much and not dealing with the actual problem of what mass incarceration is. And so it is important, but I think the larger issue is really the inhumane conditions and the very sort of the tortured situations that people are put in, and this sort of societal and spiritual crisis that is occurring right now.
Yeah. I think that's super powerful and an important thing to remember. I appreciate very much folks who push us to think carefully about how to refer to them. I think it's important for us to be as accurate as possible. This is something I feel like we've talked about, together before. It's important for us to be accurate. I feel like a lot of the language that we use is shorthand. It allows us to look away from the situation that people find themselves in. And so it's on us to do, I think to do two things. And I think there's a line here. I mean, on the one hand, is to respect the folks that we're spending time with. And some of those folks, for some of us, are friends and family. So Keri talked about having been incarcerated. In the book, I write about my brother being incarcerated. And Jaime, you're very close to these folks. I mean, you spent mad time with these women who are fighting these fires. These are people who you come to know and care for in a very deep way. Not to mention, the contacts that you make, since writing, for example, the book on ODB, these kinds of things. And so these are our friends. These are our family. This is us. And so attending carefully to how we talk about them, but also just making sure. I mean, to this point that you raised earlier, that we're painting an accurate picture. I mean, we lock people away for years and years and years and years. We put them in cages. We separate them from their family. We steal their freedom, and then we hold on to that forever, in effect, in different ways and in different variations. And I feel like there's really a lot of sugarcoating, really a lot of turning away, really a lot of not talking about the situation that people find themselves in, and that's a disservice to the folks that we care for.
Yeah, there was another language issue that I was really surprised at that I had to weigh, which was whether or not a lot of the people that I interviewed referred to themselves as girls and the other, people as girls. And I sort of would always, lean on the idea that they were women, they're mature. But then I realized, some of the people I interviewed started serving time at 19.
Yeah.
That's girls. Like, we're talking about still forming, your brain is still forming. And so I ended up using the word girls a lot too, and sometimes interchangeably, because some of the people were so young who had started in this, risking their lives fighting fires while they were serving time because they didn't want to serve time in a state prison.
So, one of the other sort of process issues in this type of writing that I want to talk about a little is the logistical difficulties of keeping in touch with people in prison. Like, you can't just call them whenever you want, and when they call you, it's like $20 a call. And Reuben, I was wondering if you could talk about some of the other costs of like keeping in touch with people in prison, sort of financially and on a personal and communal level.
No, for sure. I mean, so there's a chapter in the book. I appreciate you sort of, teeing it up.
It was a great chapter. I liked it, obviously.
I appreciate it. There's a chapter in the book called Millions of Details that opens with a phone call from my brother. And this is a collect call. And at this point, so I was born, I'll say a little bit about, how I came to this work, which is, something I think we'll start digging into too. I mean, I was born poor and Black after 1972, so I'm born into what we would call the mass incarceration generation. And so, it wasn't just my family, folks in my family who did time. It was every other person I knew who spent some time in a jail or prison. And most folks in this country are connected to someone who's done time. So just to say, I mean, the stats are alarming. I mean, 1 in 2 Americans has a loved one that's been to jail or prison. 1 in 8 white women in this country, for example, has a loved one who's currently serving time in an American jail or prison. Now, the racial disparities are egregious. It's 1 in 2 Black women, but it's 1 in 8 white women too. So like, this is a giant American problem is what I'm trying to say. But it's one that we tend to ignore. And so a big part of what we ignore are the costs to fiscal and otherwise. I mean, so every time my brother called me, my brother did time, and it's all right about what it means to care for my brother as I'm following people who are caring for their brothers, sisters, cousins, uncles, and also following people who are locked away. And anyway, so every time my brother called me, collect, it'd be $6.55, which was after a series of reforms in the state of Michigan where he was incarcerated. It used to be much higher. And if he called from the jail, it would be much higher, $14, $15 after this series of reforms that brought down the cost. But it wasn't just that. I mean, there's the cost of the phone call. There's the cost of covering his food because they never fed him enough. He used to talk to me all the time about always being so hungry. And so I'd sit at my desk and I'd order through a second private service provider called Michigan Packages, $85 worth of food because they let us suspend the rules on how much you could send in commissary to allow you quarterly to send this additional food. So it's an $85 worth of ramen noodles, soap, summer sausages, these kinds of things. And he needed this because they didn't feed him enough. And so the family member covers the cost of food. The family member covers the cost of phone calls. The family member covers the cost of the visit, the gas to get to and from the prison. Prisons can be 5, 6, 7 hours away from your home. Then there's the logistical cost, the time that it takes out of your schedule. I was a young assistant, well, fairly young, I'm middle-aged, I guess, but relatively young, assistant professor trying to have a career, and I'm going to get this phone call that I have to take in the middle of a faculty meeting, or or in the middle of a date with my wife, or in the middle of spending time with my own children, you know? And so anyway, there are all these costs that literally bankrupt families. On top of those costs are court fines and fees, you know, $1,600 on average on court fines. My brother had to spend $600 to cover the cost of a public defender who he met for the first time for 20 minutes on the day he accepted a plea deal. So these costs seriously bankrupt families. There's a wonderful report from the Ella Baker Center from a few years ago called "Who Pays?" and it traces, for example, the fiscal cost that families bear, and families are certainly made to pay over and over and over again.
Yeah, you know, I guess aside from, you know, visits and the cost of phone calls, I think another thing that a lot of people sort of don't know about prison is just what the whole visiting process is like. And Jaime, I know we talked about this some before. I think you're the only person here whose first visit to a prison was as a reporter, and it's, you know, quite a process. But can you walk us through a little bit of what it's like to visit a prison, like just as a reporter, but also generally as a human, what that feels like?
Yeah, I mean, it's horrifying. It's definitely not as horrifying as probably having to be inside of a prison. But the first time that I went to a prison was when I was reporting the ODB book, and I was going up to Clinton Correctional. And I actually made the mistake of requesting, I thought it would be better if I announced myself as press and that I was doing this interview, and that they would, you know, it would be so much easier. I think that that was a huge mistake and such a novice error, because they had me waiting for, I think, something like 4 hours. There was a guy who came out with a slash across his face and like a makeshift thing. And I think they just kind of didn't want me to be able to visit the person that I was visiting. I was interviewing someone who had been in prison with Old Dirty Bastard, and it was this kind of like roving, you know, they were sitting, the correctional officers were sitting there complaining about the slashing, and they were just sort of like, oh, what a pain, we have to clean up blood. And then this poor guy is being kind of like dragged out with blood dripping from his face and a slash across of it. There was an upside to waiting. That was horrifying in every way. And, you know, I was kind of, I don't even know what, I didn't know what was happening. I was like, why? It was just terrifying for that person, and that he clearly wasn't going to get the help that he needed. There was another contingent also waiting, and that was the Conjugal Wives. And that was actually a really, that was really fun, because I got to talk to them about sort of all of the things that they do to plan for this visit. And it was so interesting to hear them talk about all the things that they buy and what they look forward to, and that they get to see their husbands, and that they got married for this specific reason so that they could actually have this close human contact, and that it only happened every so often, but that they would make special things, they would wear special things. And it was like this whole, you know, other side of it that I didn't know existed. And then when I actually went inside, you're just walking down these hallways, and these just really, it's so, you know, it's so specific, the architecture, and it's so clear that you are supposed to be afraid, and you are supposed to be terrified. And I think that, you know, the person that I was interviewing, he was like desperate for anything from the vending machine. So we got food from the vending machine, and we sat and we talked, and he had half of his eyeglasses were smashed because he had gotten in a fight of some kind. And I couldn't tell if he wanted me to help him get new eyeglasses or what was happening. So that was my first impression. And I remember afterwards, I was just shaken to the core. And then since then, you know, I have gone to women's prisons more, to the fire camps more, and it's slightly different. It wasn't as extreme, but the feeling remains that if you're on the other side of it, if you're not the person who's walking in knowing that you are going to walk out, that you're sitting there looking at people who are not being treated as people, and that it's just a terrifying proposition. And it's engineered to be that way.
Yeah, that's totally how it felt from the other side. You know, I also think that as media, we get despite the horrors that you saw, like, we get the best of it. Like, when my friends and family would visit me, like, they kind of treat you like shit because you're still visiting, like, just an inmate. They, many of them don't necessarily see as a person. I was smiling though when you were talking about the conjugal visits. Those trailer visits were like so legendary in New York prisons. Like, a lot of states don't have that, but for people that don't know, they would have like a weekend where you could go to a trailer with your loved one if you had low enough security status and you hadn't gotten in trouble for a long time, and you could like spend a whole weekend in like close proximity. And it wasn't just for couples, like you could see your kids and stuff too. And that's what the women were, so excited about, was like being able to see their kids. Because the rest of the time in the visiting room, like you said, the vending machine candy is what's so important. I made a Thanksgiving meal out of, Reese's and Snickers, and we wrote like turkey in the Reese's with a paper clip and pretended that was our Thanksgiving dinner. So yeah, it's always so interesting to me to hear people's impressions of visiting when they haven't seen it from, the side I saw it from. But Reuben, I was interested in hearing some about how you think these barriers and just sort of the difficulty and how intimidating it is to go to visiting, like how these barriers to keeping in touch and seeing what's inside prisons changes how you approach writing about them.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I mean, thinking carefully about so the two sides to this. So one side to this is all the criminological literature tells us that things like connection with family is not only good for the person who's on the inside, but it helps them get through. It's better for the prison, which is why visits happen, I think, right? There's something called penological interest. So it's of interest to them. And it also, and those strong family connections are also preventative later. So folks who have strong ties, for example, with their families, are less likely to go back to jail or prison later. Like, the literature tells us that, it's very clear. Yet everything we do breaks those connections. It breaks those connections. And so there are two ways that I've really thought about that. One has been from sort of the researcher as a sociologist studying the thing. It's curious to think of, like, so it's a question, it's an open question. It's well, what does it mean to desire, to want, to benefit from, like every other human being, contact with someone else, and for that to be denied you? And then as somebody who was actively caring for loved ones who are moving in and out that thing, right? Like, so it's like actively caring for family members and knowing friends, visiting friends, people from my neighborhood who were in and out of jails and prisons, who I'd see as I visited, as I was spending time there. That side of it gave me a kind of proximity to the question. So it allowed me it helped me in my inquiry. So I wanted to ask different questions. I wanted to know, so I know as an outsider coming in that the hamburgers in that vending machine are awful. Like the White Castle knockoff hamburgers inside this vending machine are awful. So I know they're awful. And I know what it's like to taste those things. And I know what it's like to watch my loved one demolish those things as if they're the best tasting thing ever. And I know the feeling. I know what it's like when a loved one's marched away when that visit ends and somebody you care about is marched away, sometimes in chains. And this for me became a place to ask questions from, to talk about a specific kind of disappointment. And in the writing, to write from that feeling in the pit of my stomach, to like know it, to know it intimately, and to write from that place. And so my writing was shaped by on the one hand, the experience of doing the science, but also, and I think more importantly, from the experience of knowing the disappointment, of knowing the longing, of knowing what it means to love somebody who's on the other side of that cage, who I can only speak with 15 minutes at a time, and having now an insight into imagining what it must have been like to be a kid who's going through life's first disappointments, to have to only be able to talk to my mother 15 minutes at a time when she calls, hoping that perhaps it might be on one of those days when I've had a really terrible day or a really wonderful day or a really mundane day, and never actually being able to sort of signal to request the call and that call come in that moment. So it was really, if I were to put it in a phrase, it was really like learning how to write from disappointment, but also knowing how to write from the joy of the connection when it's finally made. It was really, I think I learned how to write from the emotion of it. That's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, I feel that. Someone who's been writing about this a lot lately, I feel that. I think the whole visiting process is also kind of a window into how traumatic prison is. And Jaime, there was one part in your book about trauma that really resonated with me, which is where you have this section about this woman, I think it was Carla, who got out and is now just constantly afraid of running into police and being arrested and going back to prison. And, you know, I think there's this sort of pop culture idea of prisoners as like, you know, hardened criminals. But prison also means like constant trauma, you know, shakedowns, raids, fights, solitary confinement, like just constant strip searches. How does knowing about that trauma change your reporting practices and like how you get close to the women that you're writing about?
That's an interesting question. I think that actually I kind of assume that most people that I end up talking to have gone through some form of trauma, and I don't necessarily ask what that is or assume what it is initially, but when it's shared and when it's clear and when it gets very, the person who I'm interviewing is emotional or something really triggers, you know, you can kind of see it and you can hear it. You can hear it in the stories. You know, when Carla, whose name is actually Jessica, she's since been okay with her name being revealed, was telling me about that story, you know, I could tell that she continues to kind of fear police and to fear this idea that she might be sent back for doing something wrong, something that she doesn't know that she's doing wrong, that there were always these sort of rules and regulations that she had to follow or she'd have time added. And that went up until, you know, the week before she was supposed to be released. The camp commander like looked at her bed and said, we're going to add 30 days. And she, because her mom actually worked for a judge, like was, you know, fought it, and she was released at the time she was supposed to be released at. But that's one of the issues with this idea that, you know, these women are firefighters, and so they're needed by the state. The state is in desperate need of firefighters and these crews. And so there's an incentive to keep bodies, which is what CDCR, the correction department, calls them, there as long as possible. In terms of the trauma, I think that, you know, as you've said, and as I think is should be clear and made clear all the time, mass incarceration, being in jails, it is a trauma unto itself. You go in as a person, it is something that is narrative shifting. Your entire being changes because of your day-to-day existence, because every day you're subjected to predatory behavior by correctional officers, by violence, by malnutrition, by health issues that are not treated, you're not cared for, you're separated from your family, as Reuben mentioned. You know, there's a host of things that contribute to this just pure need to survive, and just getting out means that you've experienced however long you've served is a trauma unto itself, and then you're out into the, you know, you're sort of like you shoot out into reentry, and you're all of a sudden expected to participate and be part of, you know, society with very little support. And I think that you know, in terms of talking with people about their experiences and having them trust me when we talk, I pretty much approach every interview the same, which is I just want to get to know somebody. And if they're willing to share what they've been through and how they're feeling, that's fine. I generally don't push beyond what anyone is comfortable with. And then it ended up being a 5-year process. And so after many, many conversations and visits and, you know, shared experiences like births and deaths and pandemics, people are more willing to talk about what's going on and are more trusting. And I think that's really hard. I think it's really hard to trust anyone with your story. And I'm always surprised and grateful that somebody is willing to talk to me whenever they do.
Yeah, I find that sometimes, I don't know if you find this, but when I'm talking to people in prison, that I feel like I need to be more emotionally available for them than I do for some sources in the free world, because sometimes they have a lot less to go on. Like they have a lot fewer, you know, people on the outside in some cases, or sometimes nothing, or sometimes they're in solitary, and, you know, like their interactions with me might be like close to it. So that I've noticed in reporting, like this is one thing that I find is very different, that, you know, if they're going to put so much on the line to talk to me, because there can be such real repercussions for, you know, being in a story or a book. I feel like I need to be there and, you know, emotionally for them in some ways that, you know, other sources might just not require.
And there's a personal responsibility to it too.
Yeah,
where
exactly.
It's like you, and Reuben, this is where that I think it's the same chapter you referenced earlier, but your writing about getting the call from your brother really resonated, where you see that number, and it's so hard to, you know, to like carry that guilt, where you know that it means so much to answer the phone in that moment for the person who's calling. But sometimes it's also really hard. You're like driving or you're grocery shopping, and you can't have that conversation because it's a really intense conversation to have, you know, in a lot of places. I feel like it's really hard for me to have, you know, I get calls regularly from inside of CDCR, and I always feel guilty when I don't answer. And that's not to say that, like, you know, anyone should feel sorry for me for that, but I feel guilty anyway. Jewish guilt.
You know, I think that also this sort of question of how close you get to vulnerable sources, or how, you know, emotionally available you are for them, kind of overlaps with questions of objectivity and what role it plays in this context. I did a residency in Wisconsin last week, and the students kept asking me about this. So I've been thinking a lot about objectivity, and, you know, specifically in the context of prisons, where I think some of the traditional notions of objectivity is equal to neutrality don't quite work the same, because so much of what goes on in prisons is just objectively bad. You know, like not giving prisoners dentures, or not letting them have books in solitary, or like serving them moldy food. Like these things are just, you know, bad. And Reuben, I don't know, I'm interested to hear your thoughts on what objectivity should look like in writing nonfiction about incarceration, and also whether the process of writing this changed your thinking on that.
Yeah, I think a couple of things. I think there are many ways to learn about the world, and I think that there are objective conditions that people live under. There's a material reality. I mean, both on the inside and when folks come out, you know. And so on the inside, there are these things that you mentioned. On the outside, there's the expectation that you find work, that you stay away from. You know, you get handed a sheet of papers. You know, we all know on this call, called the conditions of release. So these aren't codified laws and anywhere. But these are laws for you. If you have a criminal record, if you've served time in jail or prison, you get handed a sheet of paper that says what you may not do and what you must do. You must report to your parole or probation officer within X number of days, probably like 72 hours of landing, maybe more like 48. You may not associate with, quote, known offenders. This means you have to break the ties that you formed over perhaps many years of incarceration. People that your bunkies, your cellies, your rappies, the law, which isn't a law for anybody else, just a law for you. Again, a material reality, a law for you on a sheet of paper says you may not talk to these people who helped get you through some of the most trying times in your life. That's an objective reality. It must be cataloged. It must be reported upon. You know, it must be studied. It must be researched. And then you say, it says, get a job. Get a job in a country where there are 19,000 labor market restrictions that target people with criminal records and only people with criminal records. Say, get a job, you must get a job. That's an objective reality. And then there's the experience of that thing. What does it mean to live under 19,000 laws, policies, and administrative sanctions that bar you from hundreds of categories of employment? What does it mean to live in a situation where it is constitutionally, where one has a constitutional right to reject your application to rent an apartment? Where a landlord can say no to you based on your criminal record, where they have constitutional cover for that because of the 13th and 14th Amendment. What does it mean to live under these conditions? And so to understand what it means to live under a set of social conditions, I have to push beyond this distance that I've put between myself and the subject of my work, to really dig in, to really understand. And the things that you can learn from a distance, like how many laws target people, a set of facts that are observable that we must, and then there are subjective things like what does it feel like? What's the emotional life of someone? And then if you allow yourself to get close, then you start asking different kinds of questions. So for me, I allowed myself to be close because I had a family, of course, who had done time. That was perhaps one reason, but also because I cared deeply for the people that I followed. And I wanted to know in a deep and powerful way, you know, like, well, what does it mean now that you've got 19,000 labor market restrictions to finally get a job? How do you leave a job if the boss is abusive? How do you what recourse do you have if everyone tells you no in the housing market? What recourse do you have when it's time to leave a girlfriend, maybe whose couch you're sleeping on, or maybe when it's time to change relationships, when all these relationships will now turn into things that you need? And so there's the objective reality. There's the counting of things. There's the distance that you need to assess a situation. But there's also something that comes from proximity. It comes from closeness, from allowing yourself to experience, to feel, to know what it feels like to be in a social situation. Those are also things that you can learn from. And so for me, that was the approach that I took. I chose to be close. I chose to be close because I couldn't have not been close if I wanted to. I was born after 1972. I was born poor and Black in this country that arrests poor Black people. So I couldn't have avoided the prison if I wanted to. However, not running from it, not pretending like it's some alien thing that's off in the distance, but something that's close to me, that's in my skin, allowed me to understand, experience, and relay, I hope, something that I wouldn't have been able to if I tried to maintain some objective a distance far from the folks that I was trying to learn about.
Yeah, you know, one of the things you said about the difficulty of like finding jobs and housing and stuff, when I got out, I mean, I think I knew obviously that it was going to be difficult at first. And I think that it's been maybe not as surprising to me, but some of the people in my life, I think, have been really surprised to see how difficult things like housing are, even 10 years later, as a, you know, fully employed white woman, you know, in a liberal area with like, I should be, you know, pretty easy to rent to. And I think that that's something that a lot of people underestimate, how long these, you know, how long the trail of incarceration lasts. And that's for someone who's, again, you know, white and fully employed. So, I mean, I'm on the lucky end of the spectrum in this, obviously. But I also, you know, we have just a few minutes left, and I was interested in hearing, I think from both of you probably, on, you know, your feelings about prison and what the point of prison is, and whether that has changed as a result of sort of deeply writing about it. I mean, I did time, and even the course of writing my book, I you know, I put a note in the to my editor in the margins, joking that I, you know, accidentally radicalized myself in the course of writing. So, so I think that, you know, I think it changes you even if you come in already knowing something. Did you guys find that?
I did. I mean, I felt like I came into it not knowing nearly as much as probably either of you. I felt like, you know, interviewing the women that I interviewed was one thing that absolutely changed my feelings about it, because they experienced, you know, probably state prison at its best. The fire camps are something that CDCR is extremely proud of. There's no fences, there isn't barbed wire, they get better food, they're outside, they're in nature, they have visits where you can hug people, cabins you can rent, you know, among state prisons, the fire camps are desirable. I mean, that having been said, they watched one of their crewmates die, and so it's not without peril and atrocity. But in addition to having interviewed these women, you know, they all had to go through county and state and described the conditions there and why they chose to put their lives in jeopardy, and that what they experienced in those situations was so horrifying that that's why they ended up becoming firefighters, was they didn't want to have to be in prison or jails. And then there were various different reports from local newspapers that, you know, and class action lawsuits and various different testimonies about details that were, you know, triggering. Every single time I read them in the manuscript, I would cry because they were so deplorable. I mean, the power dynamics between a correctional officers and women who were incarcerated was so hard to imagine being okay, you know, just that we're okay with it. Women are, you know, women and men, just that we're okay with these conditions, because people are, you know, millions of people are incarcerated, and we stand by outside existing and continuing to exist. And I think that, yes, from the beginning of when I started the book to the end, I certainly felt, I don't know if I feel like I want to avoid the word radicalized, because I think that abolition shouldn't be considered radical. I think that humanity and trying to tear down structures that don't work and bureaucracies that don't work and that are actually, they not only don't work, they're detrimental, is not a radical notion. It's trying to function as a society. It's trying to give, you know, try and support other people, and actually truly put money into rehabilitation and into communities. And I think that, that's where I ended up. Was, yes, it was horrifying to read about prisons and jails. And I don't know if I answered your question. Sorry. Reuben, take it away.
We've got like 2 minutes. Just
Yeah, I mean, I learned a million things, as I think anyone who studies anything will. I mean, so like having a loved one who's been incarcerated, didn't make me an expert on punishment. Even if I spent time in a cage myself, I wouldn't have known in the same ways the intricacies of the thing, because when you sort of dig deep, like you kind of know your experience, but I follow many people, over time. I spent about 15 years working through these kinds of questions. Started off in 2003 with Untitled Chapter. There's a whole like kind of sort of genesis of the book, but what I looked for when I went in with it was the dynamic lives that people made for themselves, and the thing that I most appreciate about the abolitionist call. And I'm wrestling with how I feel about abolition, like whether or not a prison is necessary. Like, what do you need? I'm still growing in my own ways, and so I'm working out the ethics and of that for me and for my own thought process. But the thing I appreciate most about it is the positive project of building. So abolitionists aren't just saying get rid of prisons, as Jamie pointed to. They're saying build institutions that would eliminate our need for them. Lean on an economy of care, lean on a politics of care, lean on a politic of hospitality and welcome and belonging. And this to me is it. This is what it means to be in right relation with other human beings. And so when folks call for a world in which we don't punish as our first resort, or perhaps at all, I'm intrigued. I'm interested, and I want to hear more. I want to hear more. What I found when I went to look were that people made dynamic lives for themselves, even amidst the worst of circumstances. There was joy and pleasure and community and family and love and care. And I think there's something really powerful about that we can all learn from, that we should all learn from. That's what I think.
Well, I could keep going, but we are out of time. So thank you, Jamie and Reuben, and everyone. Remember that you can order books in the link below, and please consider making a donation to the Brooklyn Book Festival, which this year is in its 16th year of free literary programming. And thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Keri. Thank you, Reuben.
Thank you. Good to hang out.
Yeah.